Hi, I'm Emily from Canine Trail Time. And one of the questions that I get asked on a regular basis is how to tell if your dog harness fits. Lots of people buy a dog harness and don't know whether it actually fits their dog properly or not, and they want some guidance on whether it does. So I've put together this video to just go through some of the things that I look for when I am doing harness fitting. So I use a system that I call the 5-star harness fitting system. And what I do every time I look at a dog's harness fit is look firstly at the neck. So the harness should not restrict the breathing, but it should be snug so that there is no excess movement in the harness when it's sitting on the dog's neck. The shoulder area should be left free and unrestricted so that your dog can move. The chest should be unrestricted, so the harness can sit in close behind the front legs, but not in the sensitive area directly behind the legs. You want the harness, if it is a longer style harness, or even with some of the shorter style harnesses, to not come behind the last ribs, what we call the floating ribs of the dog. There should be room for your dog to breathe, so don't obviously do the harness up too tight. And you also want the harness to not come over the hips and restrict movement. So here is just a little example of those 5-star harness fitting areas in a graphic on my dog Yogi. So we're looking at the neck, we're looking at the shoulder, we're looking at the chest, the ribs, and the hips. And again, here is a graphic that we've got of a dog who is actually wearing a properly fitted non-stop free motion harness, paying particular attention to make sure that the neck fits, the shoulder is free, the chest is unrestricted, the ribs, the harness is coming not behind the last ribs, and the harness isn't sitting restricting the hips. So to go into a little bit more detail, I've drawn on this graphic of Yogi the area where the harness would ideally fit on the neck. And this might look a little bit high to some people, but this is actually the area where it is going to impact your dog the least. So in this neck area, you want the harness to fit ideally. I've got an example here of a harness that's fitted on my dog Yogi, which shows that harness fitting correctly, leaving the shoulder area free. The green oval shows that his whole shoulder area is left free to move unrestricted. And you can also see from this image that the harness is actually sitting slightly above his sternum, which is the bony landmark at the front of the chest. So this point here would be his sternum, and the harness is sitting just above that. And many people will use that as a point for harness fitting and say that it needs to fit on the sternum or below the sternum. But as long as it's not coming up into the fleshy part of your dog's throat, then that neck fits fine. Another example of a dog wearing a free motion harness with the shoulder area left completely free. Again, the green oval indicates the whole of the front of that shoulder is free because the neck is quite snug and it's not coming down over the shoulder. This is an example of a harness that is actually too big. The neck is too big on this harness. And you can see from the red arrow that it is actually coming down over the front of the shoulder on this dog. So that is not what we want when we are fitting a harness and having our dogs free to move in it. So this harness is actually too big in the neck. And we've got a side view of this as well, which also shows perhaps a little bit more clearly how restrictive this harness is on the shoulder. And this is not what we want when we're asking our dogs to move in harness. So this is a different harness. This is a 0 DC short, but it's just showing how the neck being too big on this harness can actually restrict the top of the shoulder on this dog when he's moving. So you can see at the base of the neck up here, it's actually coming back quite far, but also it is touching the top of the shoulder here. And again, that's because the neck is too big. This is the same harness on a different dog, a slightly clearer view where you can see that the harness is actually pressing on the top of the shoulder where the point of the red arrow is, and will actually restrict movement when the dog is moving. So these are examples of harnesses that are too big in the neck. So moving on to the next 2 points in the 5-star harness fitting system, you've got the shoulder and the chest. And I've done these together just for ease to show you. But basically, I've added to my little diagram, and you don't want any material coming into this area where the red cross is here. So the harness should fit above this line and behind this line, because this area should be left free to move. So this is an example of a harness that's fitted correctly and leaves the whole of the shoulder area free to move. You can see the green oval indicates all the area of the shoulder free, and it's also not coming in too close behind the front legs. This is an example of a harness where the harness is too big, and so it is encroaching on the shoulder. It's coming down onto the shoulder and would cause problems with restriction of movement from the top there. It's quite hard to get a photo of a dog in a harness that's too small, because often you won't get them over the head. But this is an example where the chest is too small, and you can see that it is pinching up in behind the front legs. So that red arrow shows you where the restriction is on that harness. So moving on to the ribs, I mentioned that you don't want anything coming back behind the last ribs. So I've added another little cross into my diagram here. So this is where Yogi's last ribs are, and you don't want anything coming behind here. So we'll show you that on a harness. This is the Arctic Wolf Multi-Sport. And on this dog here, it is sitting in exactly the right place alongside the ribs rather than behind the ribs. So this is an example of a well-fitted multi-sport harness. And you can also see the neck is snug on that one too. This is an example of a dog that is in a badly fitted non-stop harness. And you can see where the red arrow is pointing is where it is coming behind the ribs and could potentially pull up into the dog's stomach when they're running, because if they are pulling really hard and that harness comes behind the ribs, it can pull up. So that is not an example of a good fitted harness. Just wanted to show you another type of harness, so the X-back harness. And again, this is quite clear on this dog that it is coming behind the last ribs. It's potentially going to pull up and cause discomfort. You can also see that it's coming back and restricting the hips, but we're going to move on to that now. So the hip area on the dog is where I have added another cross on my little diagram here for Yogi, and that is where you don't want anything putting any pressure. So the harness can sort of come beyond that, but as long as there is no pressure over the hips, then we're okay. So this is an image of a dog that is in a non-stop X-back harness, and you can see from the green arrow that the dog's hips are sitting behind where the harness actually comes to. And even when this harness is pulled, you won't get any restriction with this. This is a good example of a correctly fitted X-back harness. This is an example of a X-back harness that is too long and is coming behind the ribs, but also coming over the hips and putting pressure on the dog's hips. So this is what I see quite often with X-back harnesses. People fit them too long because they go for the bigger neck, because they're not sure about how snug the neck should be on a harness. And so they fit a longer style harness, and it actually ends up being too long and restricting around the hips. So just to give you another couple of examples, I've got this photo again of a harness that's too small, and you can see that restriction in the chest. Got an example of the same harness being too big and restricting on the shoulder, where the red arrow is pointing is where you're going to get the restriction. And then you've got the correct size of harness here, showing with the green oval all that area of shoulder that's left free to move. So this harness potentially looks too small when it's first put on, but with all the harnesses that you're going to be using, they need to be pulled into to show what they will actually be doing when your dog is using them. So when you do pull this harness back, it sits in the correct place and it's leaving the hips free. It's not coming behind the ribs, and you can see that it's not restricting the shoulder at all. So if ever you're doing a check on your dog's harness fit, you do need to pull the harness to make sure that it is shown in the way that it will be when your dog is using it. Again, this photo shows the X-back that's too long, and this is not ideal, particularly if you're going to be doing dog sports such as canicross and bike jaw. So here's just a couple of examples of correctly fitting shorter style harnesses to show again the green oval. This is the area of the dog's shoulder that needs to be left free to move. So if there is anything restricting in this area, then I would say your harness probably isn't correctly fitted. But this is just to give you an example of some good harness fits. If you've got any questions on harness fitting and you're worried about your own dog's harness, then you are always free to email me, emilyt@caninetrailtime.com. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have about harness fit, but do make sure that you've taken some photos like the ones that I've shown you in this short video, so that I can see what the harness looks like on your dog from the side being pulled, and that will give me an idea of the harness fit. So hopefully that's helpful to you, and any questions, do let me know.